Welcome everyone to the para-athletic rule changes for 2020-2021 that came out earlier this year. And I am David Weicker. I'm a World Para-Athletics educator, technical delegate, and ITO, but I'm not representing World Para-Athletics tonight. I want to acknowledge with thanks John Mason, who is an ITO and technical delegate for World Para-Athletics from the United Kingdom, because some of the slides came from John and his presentation to the ITOs for World Para-Athletics. We'll talk about the rules and then we'll go into some questions and discussions to follow the presentation. So the rules and regulations and amendments can be found at https://www.paralympic.org/athletics/rules. Many administrative and regulations will not be discussed, but the World Athletic rule changes are reflected in the World Para-Athletic rule changes as well. So in other words, World Para-Athletics follows similar rules to World Athletics, but implements unique ones for para-athletes. This one we will talk a little bit about, which is in the regulations. It's the use of technology. World Para-Athletics will now monitor the use of technology and equipment. It used to be the technical delegate was responsible, but now World Para-Athletics will monitor it. And the technology principles have not changed. In other words, those within the regulations indicate that devices are not allowed if they provide an unrealistic enhancement of the height of release in throwing events, if they provide an unrealistic enhancement to stride length, if the device is not commercially available to all athletes, and it does not contain materials or devices that store, generate, or deliver energy designed to provide an athlete with an overall competitive advantage over an athlete not using such technology or equipment. So here are some of the changes in the duties for major positions. So Rule 2 identifies a number of positions for major competitions, and technical delegate is one of the most major positions at a competition. They make decisions for which no provisions exist with the LOC and or World Para-Athletics. The medical delegate has ultimate authority on all medical matters. Referees shall decide on matters which arise during the competition and where appropriate with the technical delegate. So there may be some situations where a technical delegate will be involved with the referee in question. Referee shall have authority to warn or exclude from competition any athlete or relay team guilty of acting in an unsporting or improper manner or under rules 6.1, 6.18, 7, 17.5, 18.17, 18.18, 24.2, 24.5, 24.19, or 49.8H. So this indicates, if nothing else, it's a good idea to download a copy of the rule book so that you can check it quite carefully for any potential rule violations by athletes, in particular for warning or excluding from competition an athlete. EDM checks. What we've done with World Para-Athletics is we've recommended that the EDM checks, there's an EDM officer. Actually, there probably isn't at most competitions, but EDM checks are done before the competition, pre and post events, and it's recommended to happen to occur during the event. And as an example, in the Pan American Games in Lima, Peru this past summer, there was a problem with the EDM, which was created by a host broadcast person pulling a cable through an already pre-tested scientific or EDM setup and knocking it out of alignment and creating a problem for all throws that was to the magnitude of 30 centimeters. So it wasn't a small error, it was a major error. And in fact, as a result of this, we had to contest the event again at another time. And it happened that all 4 of the athletes were available to do it again. The start referee is responsible for fair and equitable start for all competitors and has the entire control of the athletes on their marks. Some technical rule changes. Another one is 4.8, mixed gender events. Mixed gender stadium competition for races of 5,000 meters or longer are permitted only when there are insufficient athletes of one or both genders competing to justify the conduct of separate races. The gender of each athlete shall be shown in the result. Such results shall not in any case be conducted so as to allow athletes of one gender to be paced, drafted, or assisted by athletes of another gender. In field events, mixed gender field events, separate results cards plus flexibility by judges for all gender than the other gender or any combinations thereof. Examples of these in the mixed gender on the track events in Canada, we don't have a lot of athletes who are in the 5,000 or 10,000 in the female classes. So they tend to often compete with men. And this happens also with both world athletics and world para athletics. Failure to report to the call room. So Rule 5.5, it's important for call room judges and referee of the call room to observe that athletes must report to the call room on time. If they don't, athletes who fail to appear to the call room on time are recorded as a did not start for the event. And they're also given a yellow card. And for a second offense, it's a yellow card followed by a red card. And then the technical delegate would determine whether or not the athlete is allowed to compete in future events during this particular competition. Athlete bibs, this is also a change. In Rule 6.7, the athlete bib rule has changed so that athletes tended to like to put, for seated throws, they tended to like to put a bib on their knee. It's no longer allowed to put a bib on the knee, but a bib must be on the back and the chest for all athletes, with the exception of wheelchair athletes and also for athletes competing in race running. MASH testing is something that used to be done continues to be done within call room, but it used to be the responsibility of classifiers. And here is a classifier from the United States and another classifier who are showing how a MASH measurement is done. MASH is a maximum allowable standing height for athletes with 2 limb impairments or amputations. And the purpose of the MASH testing is to ensure that an athlete is not taller than they would be if they had limbs, and therefore would have an unnatural stride length based on having the prosthetic devices versus limbs. And it happens only for track and field 61 and 62 class athletes. It's done by callroom judges, and there's no post-event repeat of such MASH testing in the event of a world record being set or whatever. Eye patches, eye masks, and glasses. Rule 6.18I. Eye patches are required by all athletes within the T and F11 categories for all events, plus an eye mask is required. The eye patches must be worn from the time the athlete leaves the call room until the athlete leaves the field of play. And the eye masks can be removed between trials in a field event, but must be worn from the call room out to the field of play. Tethers, Rule 6.19 or 6.19. They should look similar to this, but they don't have to be exactly like this. They cannot be elastic. They must be used from the beginning of the event to the end of the event, and they may not be shortened, and athletes must use them as the rule indicates. They must not hold hands or hold arms and hands. They can only be guided by the tether, and that's in T11, and any T12 where an athlete is having a guide. Non-compliant equipment. This is an important new rule. If an athlete shows up to the call room with equipment that is not compliant with the rules, they would be shown as a DNS. And if they show up a second time, they cannot use this as an excuse for not competing in the event. So prosthetic devices, Rule 6.13, eye patches and eye masks 6.18, tethers 6.19, all of these must be compliant. Race runners, for Jennifer, it's one word, but capital R for race and capital R for runner. And race runner frames must meet certain requirements. Wheelchairs racing chairs must meet certain requirements. And seated throwing frames must meet certain requirements. So to summarize, in the track events, the MASH measurements are done in the call room. If an athlete fails, they're not allowed out on the field of play, and they're issued a DNS. If they show up a second time, then there would be a DNS plus a yellow card. And if they show up the second time, and they still fail the MASH, then it would be a DNS the second time and a second yellow card, which is a red card, which means they're disqualified from all further events if the technical delegate agrees with that decision. Eye patches, they must not be removed until the end of the event. If they are, it would be a yellow card. Tethers, if it doesn't comply, the athlete and guide are not allowed to compete. Again, a DNS. Non-compliant equipment, DNS plus yellow card by callroom referee or other appropriate referee, followed by a red card for a second infraction. Yellow card, red card. Nothing new there. Track events, Rule 7.3, prohibited equipment. Equipment that has the capacity to communicate is not allowed by athletes, and it's also not allowed by the assistants or guide runners. This is to make it perfectly clear that athletes and assistants and athletes and guide runners are the same person effectively. So neither one can have equipment that has the capacity to communicate. The principle is nothing can give one athlete an unfair advantage over other athletes. Assistants and guide runners, and this is the example I just referred to. So the prohibited items are smartphones, cameras or video equipment, other communication devices, glass containers, dangerous goods, all of these things that are not allowed in the call room. They're not allowed to be carried by assistants and guide runners or athletes. Race runners. There's a description of the race running frame in the rule book. It's a fairly unique frame, but the finishing is the same as the wheelchair. It's the leading wheel that goes across the finish line is where you measure the time of the athlete, not the torso. Similar to a wheelchair, it's the hub of the leading wheel. Propulsion of racing chairs can only be by hands, and an athlete cannot allow their feet to touch the track or to propel with the feet or to compensate with using a foot on the track. Relays. An important rule on relays for World Para is it doesn't matter who touches whom. It could be the outgoing athlete, so it could in fact have been the wheelchair athlete. This is the third exchange in a universal relay. It could be this athlete touching this athlete who's the incoming, or it could be the normal way is the incoming athlete touches the outgoing athlete. And this makes it clear as to the options that the relay runners have for events where it's a touch rather than baton. Throwing frames, it's strongly encouraged, and it's now in the rule book that it's encouraged that athletes will have an additional support piece to hold their throwing, it's called a holding bar. And it's generally for support, not for performance. And so this device here will help it from flexing. And if it flexes more than 5 degrees, it would be and that's difficult to tell with the naked eye. But if it flexes more than 5 degrees, then it would be a foul throw. And this helps it from not flexing. Also, the athlete, if an athlete holds the throwing frame, the holding bar at the top of the bar, it has more of a tendency to flex. And if they hold it in the middle, it won't flex as much, obviously. And this is a picture of an athlete who is, for Rule 36.1, relates to both knees have to be in contact with the throwing frame. And you can see that the athlete is not sitting facing, he's actually throwing from left to right, it's discus, And first off, I don't like the picture, but it's the picture that we have. He should be throwing discus from a cage, not on an open runway, like a pole vault runway or a long jump runway or whatever it is. But he's throwing, but he has his knees in contact, but he's sitting crossways. Clothing and helmets. 6.1, if an athlete tears off his vest while on the field of play, that would be currently a yellow card offense, unsporting-like conduct. And Rule 6.22, if an athlete takes off their helmet during a race, then that would be a yellow card for the first infraction. But in this case, this is a lap of honor, and the athlete was allowed to take off her helmet and not be issued a yellow card. So as mentioned earlier, the use of the tether must be used throughout the race until the athlete and guide runner have reached the vertical plane of the finish line. And this is Rule 7.9, Note 2. And the best way for a referee to judge this is effectively to ask the photo finish chief judge, because the photo finish of the image of the athlete crossing the finish line will show whether or not they are attached by tether. An important new rule is assistants who want to go on the field of play with athletes must be physically capable of helping with the transfer to and from the day chair. No assistance by officials or volunteers or others unless approved by the technical delegate. What we find internationally is that assistants are not really assistants, they're coaches. And because they're on the field of play, we're now making it clear that they have to be physically capable of helping with the transfer of the athlete to and from the day chair to the throwing frame in particular. Start information system, it's activated for only the T11 to T13 and T20 classes. Other athletes who may use starting blocks, they may use the starting blocks that has the start information system, but more importantly, it has the speakers in the starting blocks. So the speakers are activated, but the start information system component is not activated, because except for T11 to T13 and T20 classes, it must be used for those classes, but other athletes who do not necessarily need to use starting blocks, the starting information system does not get activated. Rule 17.7 is defining the commencement of a start. So feet or a foot leaving the plate of the starting blocks or ground, depending on whether starting blocks are being used or not. So if an athlete uses starting blocks and they're not in a class 11 to 13 or T20, and their foot leaves the plate of the foot plate of the starting blocks, it would be a false start. It's easy to detect, obviously, if there's start information system, but because not all athletes in a particular race need to be using the starting blocks, it can't be used for those who are using starting blocks. Any motion is not a false start, but may render the athlete liable for disciplinary warning, yellow card, or exclusion, red card for a second warning. For those of you who listened to Ian's presentation, I think it was just a week ago, he explained this rule fairly effectively for the World Athletics, and it's the same rule, except there's the nuance with para-athletes, who some of which will not use starting blocks, some of which will use a standing start even in 100. So they may, in fact, overbalance in some events that you would not normally see that in a World Athletics event. Again, in track events, for the race and in other places where wheelchair and racing chair is mentioned, the race runner is also included. Rules for racing chairs apply equally. So there's a definition of the length of the race running frame, the width of the wheels. There's definition that it must be able to stop using brakes. So they have handbrakes, you can see here, handbrakes on the race running frame. Just like in a wheelchair, there's a brake device. For wheelchair athletes, as well as race running events, although you won't see it very often in race running, but say in 800 meters or a 4x400 meters, cones or prisms are not used on the track. It's dangerous for wheelchair athletes to have prisms on the track. So we now have the rule change that says they're no longer used, and tape or something else that is approved by the technical delegate may be used as long as it doesn't present a safety concern or issue. Usually what happens is a piece of tape is put on the track at the cut-in line or the brake line, but sometimes it's done like photo finish people. They have a piece flat and a piece elevated above the track. So it's just tape that's elevated. So it's easier for the athletes to see. Wheelchair athletes obviously don't like the cone on the infield or the cone on the outside of the track by the brake line, because they're looking down, they're not looking up or ahead. They tend to be different from able-bodied athletes. They can't see them as easily. Now, if you have any questions on track rules, again, send them to Serge, and we'll, through the chat feature, and he will let you know when you can ask the question later. Now we're moving into field events. In ambulant field events, the regulations of the relevant governing body may specify that the competing order may be changed again after any further round of trials after the third. So this is similar to what's in effect for World Athletics. At the present time, the rule says you change after three trials. You reverse the order for the top 8, but you may do it after the fourth attempt, fourth attempt and fifth attempt as well, if the regulations of the relevant governing body indicate, or the regulations for the competition. The time limits are now back to 1 minute. These changed last year, but they're in the rule book now as 1 minute. So the only difference here is effectively the seated throwing component. The only difference between the World Athletics and World Para-Athletics. The seated throwing, it's always, it doesn't matter the number of athletes, it's always 1 minute between attempts, and they get an extra minute added between the third and fourth throws. Now, they don't need to take it, but they're allowed to have an extra minute. Now, this is for seated throwers. This is where the assistant will often come in and share a bottle of water or some refreshment with the athlete who's throwing. And again, the reality is they're not assistants, they're coaches, and they give coaching advice. If you hear coaching advice as a judge or as a referee, you are entitled to issue a warning to the athlete on behalf of the competition for the advice given. Measurements, like the World Athletics, measurement of new heights is made prior to the jumping of that height by the athletes. Or if, as Jane mentioned the other day, if a bar breaks, it needs to be, the height needs to be remeasured before the competition continues. Prosthetic devices. For athletes who use prosthetic devices, they have the option of using them, but they have to declare prior to the competition whether they're going to use the prosthetic device. If they use a prosthetic device and it falls off, the trial is not valid unless the device also clears the height within the time limit, unless it falls off during the run-up. In this case, it must be reaffixed prior to the completion of the trial. And again, they still only have 1 minute unless they're jumping for a world record or a significant record. Prosthetic devices in the long jump, again, they're optional, but if used and they fall off during the run-up, the trial is not valid. The device has to be reaffixed prior to the completion of the trial. If it falls off during the jumping motion and it lands closer to the takeoff board, then the measurement is from where the prosthetic device lands, not where the athlete lands. Long jump rule 28.1A. Now, this is a new rule that comes into effect November 1st, and it says effectively like the World Athletics, you don't need a board with 45-degree plasticine any longer, especially if video evidence is available, but it can be used to assist officials. Effective November 1st, it shall be a failure if the athlete's foot breaks the vertical plane of the takeoff line. Now, this is just a sidebar, but this has been a contentious issue for national federations for a long time. They figured that breaking the plane of the takeoff line is not an issue, but if it doesn't leave a mark. But when you see the Olympics or you see world championships and an athlete's foot goes beyond effectively the zero line, the judges will only issue a red flag or a failure if there's a mark in the plasticine. And there are some cases where there is no mark in the plasticine, but it's clearly a foul to the spectators, but it has not been clearly a foul for those in the know if there's no mark in the plasticine. So effective November 1st, 2020, this November, it shall be a failure if the athlete's foot breaks the vertical plane of the takeoff. Again, similar to World Athletics, personal implements, unless the technical manager decides otherwise, an athlete may not present more than 2 personal implements to accompany the athlete on to the field of play, or to go out with the implements. Again, no more than 2. It used to be you could take as many as you want, but now it's been limited to 2 personal implements. Secured throwing, we talked briefly about this. It's not necessary for both knees to be in contact with the same plane of the vertical edge of the seat surface, provided that all other requirements of the rule are satisfied. Here you can see an athlete sitting with a knee that's touching on both sides of the throwing frame. The other image we saw earlier was an athlete that was sitting with one knee sort of in the center here and one off to the side. So straddling one vertical edge, the corner of the vertical edge of the seat surface, or straddling both corners, as this image indicates, this is allowable. There are also a few rules relating to road races, which is Rule 49, but they're effectively the rule nuances for races for wheelchair athletes. And they refer to seating and start positions, water and misting stations, and no draft. Now there's a rule that says no drafting behind motorized vehicles. And there are also some rule nuances for visually impaired athletes about carrying water. Used to be that they couldn't carry water unless they carried it from the beginning of the event. And now they can, like World Para, like the World Athletics, they can carry it from the beginning, or if they pick it up at a regulation water station. There are also some nuances about guide exchange. You can have 2 guide exchanges for marathons, and no eye patches or masks are required by visually impaired athletes. This is not new, but it's just to reference if you have a visually impaired athlete, a T11 athlete in a road race, or marathon or road race, they don't need to wear eye patches or mask. Protests and appeals, Rule 50, where an immediate oral protest is made, the athlete is allowed to continue. The results of all athletes for all trials are considered valid if the immediate oral protest is successful. Effectively, this means if the top 8 athletes advance to the next final 3 throws, so to speak, or final 3 jumps, but someone is competing under protest, they've made an oral protest that can't be decided upon, then 9 people will go to the final, if the final 3 throws or trials. But if the oral protest is upheld, then the 9th person, their results are still deemed to be valid for their final 3 attempts. So you could have 9 people with valid attempts for all 6 attempts or 6 trials. World records and doping control, similar to World Athletics, and again, this is a regulation not within the rule book per se, but it's in the regulations attached to the rule book. If someone sets a world record, doping control of that individual is not necessary as long as doping control has been prearranged by the host organizing committee for the competition itself. It must be arranged prior to the competition, not during the competition or at the end of it. So thank you all. And Serge, if there are any questions.
Yeah, there's the first one. RV is supposed to be running. You could unmute yourself and ask a question.
Oh, yeah, it's Renee Van Andel.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just trying to differentiate between eye patches from eye masks.
Well, eye patches, as the image showed, they cover the eye socket completely. The mask is just something that goes over the face or the eyes. And if it's a T11 or F11 athlete, they must wear both. So the masks are could be replaced by sunglasses or something else that's dark, but the eye patch must completely cover the eye socket itself. Does that answer the question, Renee?
Yeah, I think so, because maybe in previous we would look at the sunglasses and see that they were taped over something, so they were completely opaque or something, and maybe that's what that's addressing or something.
Yes, well, the rule changed so that the athletes must wear the eye patches and the sunglasses. They could wear sunglasses and they still need to be opaque, but it's not as critical if they've got their eye sockets completely covered.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, and that is a rule change.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Next question, John Monroe. You can.
Hi, Dave. I've got two questions for you, and they're completely different stuff.
Okay.
First thing is, there was that long discussion about the people that, as a throws official, the person who comes into the circle in the midpoint breathing time, and it not being allowed to be a coach anymore, so that there's the person who brings the water in the middle is not there to correct problems or anything like that. But you had that listed in the track events section rather than the field events section. Second thing, on Monday night, when Jane did her presentation, and there was the business about maximum of 2 implements to be brought to the call room for verification.
Actually, it's not the call room, it's a technical room.
Well, okay, yeah, same idea.
Yep.
If normal, my impression has always been that if that the athletes don't know, they'll drop them off the night beforehand for a competition. They will not know whether the implement have both checked in or not, correct?
Correct.
So Jane had sort of said that, well, if she was the person in charge of the technical room and somebody's implement didn't check in, they would allow a replacement attempt or a replacement implement to come in, so there would be 2 coming out to the event. But the thing for me is, even here, if you're only allowed to bring 2 in and 1 or both doesn't check in, you will not know that fact until you actually show up at the competition site, normally the next day, correct?
That would be correct. And a technical delegate would be contacted by the technical manager likely. And the sooner you know that an implement doesn't measure correctly, the sooner you can let the athlete know, and the technical delegate can allow another implement to be substituted for the one or both of them that if they don't meet the requirements.
But you, as the official on the field, or as the chief official of the event, you're not going to know that until you get out onto the field practically. and you have the person you've delegated to go get the implements and bring them out, they'll come out with a list of, okay, X, Y, and Z didn't check in. But so there's going to be a lot of running around. If implements do not check in properly, there's going to be a lot of running around in the last 15 minutes before a competition to be able to find a replacement, get it put through the verification process, and then brought out to the field.
Right, and that's why the technical delegate will be involved with the technical manager, or the technical manager would contact the technical delegate saying, this implement didn't measure for this athlete. And then the technical delegate has a way of reaching the athletes to let them know as soon as possible. So if they're brought in the night before for a competition and they don't measure up, it's not going to happen 15 minutes before the event. It's going to happen the night before.
So in essence, so this is basically going to be resolved high levelly without the actual officiating team knowing what's going on. Right. Because if it's going to be resolved the night beforehand, with the technical delegate getting in, then it's going to be done. Then everything is going to be corrected, and it's all going to be okie dokie when the implements get transported out to the event location.
Exactly. So the field event crew won't know any of what's gone on about behind the scenes. And if an athlete complains that their implement isn't part of the group that comes out for throwing, then as a field event official, you would do what you normally would, which is try and find out where it is, because it may have just been mistakenly sent to the wrong event site. And we see this in World Para Athletics, where there's two pools and the implements go to the wrong pool. That sometimes occurs. As it does for World Athletics, it happens for World Para. And so now it makes it easier effectively for the athletes. There's more communication between the technical team, technical manager or technical delegate, and the athlete about their implements when they try and check them in.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Shannon, you have a question? Unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
So in terms of the personal implements, are the athletes still expected to know that they will be shared amongst the other athletes in their group?
Athletes are advised of this when they take their implements to the technical manager. So they do realize that they are being shared by all athletes.
Okay, I just wanted to confirm that that was still in place. And just a comment to the last question, one of the local meets that I was involved with here in Nova Scotia, we had a specific cutoff time for the weighing in of our implements. And if the implements that were going to be used were not confirmed an hour before the event, then they could not submit any personal implements. So that's how we ran it here, and it worked really well.
Well, that's fine. I mean, effectively, that's your technical regulations, and if your technical regulations say one thing, then they supersede. And the rule book is intended to deal with issues that aren't in technical regulations. So if you've decided that they cannot use implements that don't measure up, as long as they're submitted 1 hour before the event, whatever your technical regulations say, that's fine. So that's a good way of handling it. For national championships in Canada, we usually say the night before is when you have to have your implements in for weighing in.
There's other have question. No more question. Going. Oops. Gilles has a question. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, David. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Gilles, and you?
Very good. Very good. Okay. Just a question about the theater. Does the athlete has to buy from a recognized, authorized store, or could he manufacture himself or herself his own theater?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the word.
The tether, you know.
Tether?
The tether.
You can manufacture your own tether as long as it meets the requirements, and the requirements are laid out in the rule book.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, you can come up with your own. And I've been a technical delegate at competitions where there hasn't been a quote unquote legal tether being used by any athletes. So I basically said to all of the athletes that the results are not valid for meeting qualifications for other events because the tethers don't meet the requirements. And then they started bringing me their tethers and showing me, and I would measure them to see if they were valid. It's something that the call room personnel need to be cognizant of. If someone brings in a tether that doesn't meet the requirements, sometimes the call rooms will have extra tethers that they can lend to the athletes, but like relay batons, they need to come back after the event.
Okay.
And usually when an athlete at a major competition, when an athlete goes to the call room, they leave their accreditation and they don't get their accreditation back unless if they've borrowed a tether, they don't get their accreditation back until the tether comes back.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Pritam has a question. Unmute yourself.
Hi, David. It's Pritam.
Hi,
Question
Pritam.
for you. For the wheelchair, the wind gauge at a point of time it used to be lower for wind measurement and all that. And now the fact that okay, it is the same for each and every one in track event does not disadvantage those doing a wheelchair athletes or in a way or whatever.
Well, I
Right.
believe there is an advantage for an athlete but it's the same for all athletes. And the rule was actually changed about six years ago that it would be the same height as able-bodied. And that's just to make it easier for the officials. For photo finish, this again an aside, for photo finish, when they have the they have to lower the braking of the plane for automatic times to go on the scoreboard. They have to lower that plane in order to get a more accurate time for the posting for the unofficial winning times. So I personally believe the wind gauge should be lowered, but I don't make the rules.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Other people has a question.
Hi, this is Lily. I had to leave the room for a second or two, and I missed the rules on the relays. If you could quickly tell me what you said, that'd be great.
Well, the relay rules, there are two rules effectively relating to relays, but the main one that I discussed was that for relays where you don't use a baton, the touch can be by either athlete, the ingoing or the outgoing athlete. It doesn't matter who touches whom, just that a touch needs to be made. And the image I showed was of the universal relay, and it was the third exchange where you've got an ambulant athlete touching a wheelchair athlete. And the first time that we saw this as an issue was in 2018 at the European Para Championships, where the wheelchair athlete touched the ambulant athlete, and the local judges didn't know what to do about it, but the rule book just says a relay exchange must be made, which by touch. It doesn't say who touches whom. The second rule, which I didn't discuss or only referred to it, is the same as the World Athletics, which is if an athlete in a relay does something incorrect, the whole team is disqualified. But if the athlete does something which is unsporting-like, then only the athlete will be issued a yellow card, or it could be a red card. If the athlete's issued a red card, then the team becomes disqualified. But if it's a yellow card, it only affects the athlete with the yellow card. I hope that answers the question, Lily.
Okay, Dave, it's John Monroe again. I got nothing for you.
John, there's someone else before
Okay.
you. Ian Fisher, you have a question? Unmute yourself.
Dave, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Ian.
A couple of questions, Dave. Regarding mixed gender, both WPA and WPA mentioned that if there are insufficient athletes of one gender or the other, you can have a mixed gender race. The
Correct.
question is, how many are sufficient?
Well,
It doesn't say anywhere.
no, it doesn't say what's sufficient, but by experience, 3 of one gender is not sufficient for a 10K.
So it's more of a judgmental thing, isn't it?
It's more of a judgment call, and usually it's the technical delegate who would say, let's combine these races.
Fair enough. Yeah. I have a second question. Is a rolling start permitted?
A rolling start, I would have to refer to Ian, but in my estimation, a rolling start is defined as movement forward where one foot might leave the ground or the foot pads, which would be where there's an opportunity for an athlete to stop, but he doesn't. It would be a false start.
Right.
So rolling start would be a false start, in my opinion.
Yeah, I understand that the rule says if their hands or feet don't leave the track of the ground, it should not be a false start. It'd be yellow. However, in 16.7.2 in the green notes afterwards, in the WA rules, it mentions the fact if they consider it as a deliberate forward motion, it should be a disqualification, even though the hands or feet have not left the blocks.
Yeah, the start referee or the start team would make a decision, and the start referee would confirm or deny the recommendation of the start team based on what he or she may have seen.
Yeah, I agree. I think when the rule book came out saying that no hands or feet leave the track, it's not a false start, that really muddied the waters. And I don't know if Ian really clarified it, where you can charge a false start even though hands and feet have not left the ground. Correct?
Maybe if Ian or Eric Zemper unmutes themselves, they can discuss this issue.
Okay, I'll close up. Thank you.
Okay, I've not started many races.
If Ian's not going to jump in, this is Eric.
It's Ian here.
Okay, Ian, you go ahead and take it.
Yeah, and if you have forward motion that follows into a start, that will be a false start. And so if you have forward movement, if you have forward movement that does not stop, then that is a false start. If you have forward movement and then it stops and you are then still, then that, and your feet or hands haven't left the blocks or the ground, then that is not a false start.
So that would be that would confirm, Ian, that a rolling start needs to have forward motion, and if you've stopped, then it's not forward motion any longer.
Correct. And the problem is that if you have a rolling, what we normally term as a rolling start, that is forward motion, and that is an advantage.
So just to clarify, I'll jump in and add forward movement that is not stopped and continues into a full start. But even though the hands and feet don't lose contact before the gun, that is still a false start. That's a rolling start.
Perfect. Thank you. That clarifies that, Eric. Thank you very much.
John Monroe, you're next.
Okay. Dave, this is probably not for you so much as for Serge.
The answer is no.
No. The way the screen shows up for me, and I'm assuming for everybody else, you have the PowerPoint in the background, and on the right-hand side of the screen, there's 3 or 4. There'd be place for people to see what's going on at home.
Yep.
Now, is that what in the copy of the presentation that you're going to send to us? Are we getting just the PowerPoint, or are we getting the little black squares on the side?
The PowerPoint only.
Okay, good. Because the thing is, when there was the discussion about the time limit having been changed from 30 seconds back to a minute, the seated times were all underneath the black squares, whereas the other 2 columns, you had set it up as 3 columns, and the seated times were on the right-hand side, and those were all underneath the squares.
Right.
So I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
On your screen, you can hide the video panel and see only the presentation if you wanted to.
How do you do that?
Well, on the top of the screen, where it says more.
Yeah.
You click on hide panel, hide video panel, then it'll show you just the screen.
Okay. Learn something new every day. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Pritam, you're next.
David, could you please elaborate a bit more on the application of the vertical plane in horizontal jump for the T11 and T12, please? Because for them, we use a landing area and all that. So could you just elaborate a bit on that?
So on vertical jumps?
Horizontal jumps.
Horizontal jumps? I didn't talk about the T11, T12, the takeoff area, because there's no rule change there. It's the same rule. Effectively, there's a chalked off area of 1 meter in length, and the width of the takeoff area, and you measure from the mark in the chalked area to the mark in the sand in the landing area. That's the distance of the athlete's jump. Does that help?
Typically, the scratch line is going to be where we are going to consider for the vertical plane if ever the athletes go beyond that one, right?
So for horizontal jumps, if they go past the chalked area, then it's a foul. If they jump before the chalked area, you measure from the first part of the chalked area.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
If I have no more questions, that would be the end of the webinar for tonight. I want to thank Dave for the presentation, all the effort and the work he did for the presentation. As Dave said, that I will send you the presentation to all of you this evening. No problem, you will receive it. Please, as I was saying to the chat on the chat, please reply to the survey I did send you just before the webinar. That's helping us to improve and to make sure if we need something else or some other subject to add to our webinar series. Don't hesitate. And thanks, David, for everything. And thank you for all of you to attend the webinar. We'll see you next week, June 8th, international competition. Will be interesting, and the discussion panel will be there. If you have anything else to say.
Thank you, David and Serge.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
Night all.
Thank you, Serge.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Have a good
Thank you,
night,
David.
everybody.
Stay well.
And
Good
safe.
night.
Good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
guys.
Go Canucks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.
David, a small comment.
Yes.
So
Yes.
on the website of Canada Athletics, it's still having the display of the whole rule book for World Para Athletics. I don't know who is in charge of updating that one.
Well, the website Serge will update, and yeah, I think the last time I looked, it even had the 2016 rule book or 2017-18 or 16-17, not 18-19. So I'm not sure what's there now, but 2021 should be there.
Okay, checking that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
And the link for it was in the beginning of the presentation. So Serge can just throw that link on the website.
We'll try to do that.
Okay.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Serge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Thank you, David. Wow.
Thank you. Bye, bye.
Bye.